Sign this, my brother said, sliding a single sheet across the funeral home's guest book table. It's just the visitor log. I looked down. It wasn't the visitor log. It was a release form. The kind that waives your right to contest anything later, and he'd folded it, so only the signature line showed. We were standing 4 feet from our father's casket. I want to say I hesitated because I was shocked. I wasn't. I'd known Derek my whole life. I folded it back up and handed it to him. Not today, I said. He smiled, the way he always smiled when he was losing an argument in public. All teeth, no eyes. Suit yourself, he said. Then he leaned in close enough that our mother wouldn't hear, and he said the sentence that would follow me around for the next 4 months. You're not in the will, Rachel. Dad told me himself. I didn't answer him. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over a room full of people paying respects, and I didn't want to break it over a folded piece of paper. I went and stood by my husband instead. Tom put his hand on my back. You okay? No, I said. But not because of what you think. He didn't ask what I meant. That should have told me something. But grief makes you generous with the people you love, even when they don't earn it. My name is Rachel Coleman. For 22 years, I've worked as a certified public accountant. The last 11 of them auditing small businesses across 3 counties in western Pennsylvania. Restaurants, machine shops, a bowling alley that turned out to be laundering exactly nothing interesting, just badly run. People assume accounting is dull. It isn't. Every business is a story written in numbers, and numbers don't know how to lie convincingly. People lie. Numbers just sit there being wrong until somebody notices. My father, Walter Ashworth, ran a hardware store on Route 9 for 35 years. Ashworth Hardware. Everybody in Millvale knew the place, knew Dad, knew the brass service bell on the counter that he'd bought second-hand in 1988, and never replaced because, in his words, a bell that still rings is a bell that still works. He rang it himself sometimes, for no reason, just to hear it. I used to think that was silly. I understand it better now. Dad also owned the duplex next door to the store. 2 units he'd bought cheap in the 90s and rented out for 30 years. The income. Padding out a retirement, the capsic out a retirement. He was never in a hurry to take. He worked until he was 78 because the store was the only place he felt fully like himself. My mother, Diane, worked the register on Saturdays even after she officially retired from the school district, mostly because she liked being near him. Liked being near him. My brother Derek is 3 years older than me. He ran a landscaping company, Ashworth Lawn and Landscape, for about 15 years, and for most of that time, it did fine. Nothing spectacular, but fine. Then, an ice storm in the winter before last took out half his equipment in one night, a line of credit he'd used to expand. 2 seasons earlier, came due at the worst possible time, and a commercial contract he'd been counting on for the spring. Got canceled when the client filed for bankruptcy. By that summer, Derek owed a supplier in Erie almost $60,000, and the supplier had a lawyer who did not care about ice storms. I didn't know all of that at the time. I knew Derek was stressed. Everybody's brother is stressed sometimes. What I didn't know was that he'd started asking our father for money the way you ask a bank, in installments with explanations that got a little less specific each time. Mets. And here's where the story actually starts. 6 months before Dad died, on a Tuesday afternoon in March. I was sitting in the parking lot of an Aldi, eating a protein bar in my car, because I'd skipped lunch for a client meeting that ran long, when my phone rang and it was Dad. We talked maybe once a week, mostly logistics. Was I coming up for Easter? Did I want the rest of Mom's canning jars? That sort of thing. This call was different from the first sentence. Rachel, he said. If stress, no drama. He said if somebody signs a paper, giving another person control over something, and then later, they're not sure they understood what they signed, is that paper any good? I sat up straighter. What kind of paper, Dad? Property paper. Business paper. I don't know yet, that's the problem. I asked him if this was about the store. There was a pause I still think about. Maybe, he said. I don't want to say more than that until I know I'm not just being a suspicious old man. You're allowed to ask questions about your own business, I told him. I know that, he said, a little sharp. Then, softer. I just don't want to accuse your brother of something and be wrong about it. That would be worse than not asking at all. I told him if something felt off, he needed somebody outside the family to look at it. A lawyer who wasn't already tangled up in Ashworth family Thanksgivings. He asked if I knew anybody. I gave him 2 names, both estate and small business. Attorneys I'd worked with professionally. Neither one with any connection to me beyond referrals. A week later he texted, one line, went with Nolan. Good instincts, kid. I didn't ask what happened next. I've replayed that decision more times than I can count. 4 months later, Dad had a heart attack in the stockroom of his own store, between a shelf of pipe fittings and a case of birdseed, and by the time the ambulance got there from the volunteer station 11 minutes away, there was nothing anybody could do. He was 79. My mother found him. I will not describe that morning any further than that, because it isn't mine to describe for entertainment, and because some things a family carries privately, even when they're telling the rest of the story out loud. The funeral was 4 days later. That's where Derek slid me the folded paper and told me I wasn't in the will. I want to be precise about what I felt in that moment, because for months afterward people assumed I felt betrayed, or humiliated, or robbed. I didn't. What I felt was confusion, because the sentence didn't match the father I knew. Dad wasn't a man who kept score. They've the neighbor's lawn for a decade after the neighbor's husband died and never once mentioned it to anyone. If he'd left me out of something, he'd have told me why. To my face, not sent my brother to whisper it over a casket. 3 days after the funeral, my mother called a family meeting at her house. The house I grew up in, on Larkspur Street, with the same brown recliner Dad used to fall asleep in during football games, still sitting in the corners, like it was waiting for him. Derek was there with his wife, Melissa. Tom came with me. My mother sat at the head of the dining table, in Dad's usual chair, which nobody had said out loud was strange, but everybody had noticed. There's paperwork to get through, my mother said. Derek's been handling it. He slid a stapled packet toward me. 6 pages. Consent to administer the estate, under the existing will, waiver of formal accounting, transfer authorization for store assets to facilitate ongoing operations. I started reading. Derek said, "You don't need to go through the whole thing, it's standard." I kept reading. Melissa said, "Everyone else already signed." I looked up, everyone but me. "That's right," my mother said. Like, that settled something. I asked the obvious question. If it's standard, why does it matter whether I read it first? Nobody answered right away. Then Derek said, "Because Mom needs this handled quickly, and dragging it out just makes things harder on her." I looked at my mother. "Is that true, Mom? Do you need this signed today?" She hesitated exactly long enough for me to see the hesitation. "It would help," she said, which is a very different sentence than the one Derek had given me. I told them I wasn't signing anything. I'd been handed 10 minutes earlier, and that I'd have questions once I'd actually read it. Derek's jaw tightened in a way I recognized from childhood. Right before he used to slam a door. Instead, he just said, "This is exactly why, Dad." And then he stopped himself. I asked him to finish the sentence. He didn't. Tom didn't say much during any of this, which in hindsight should have bothered me more than it did. On the drive home, he said, "You could have just signed it," he said, "given your mom 1 week without a fight." I looked at him. "Did you read it?" He didn't answer that either. I want to be fair to Tom here, because this isn't only a story about my brother. Tom is not a cruel man. He's a conflict-avoidant one, which is a different flaw. And it does different damage, slower and quieter, but real. 2 nights later, I found a voicemail on my phone from a number I didn't recognize, a Pittsburgh area code. "Mrs. Coleman, this is Patricia Nolan. I represented your father. He asked that I contact you after his passing. Please call at your convenience." I sat on the edge of my bed and listened to it twice before I understood what it meant. Dad hadn't just taken my referral 6 months earlier. He'd left instructions for her to find me specifically. Once he was gone. I called the next morning from my car, in the parking lot outside my office, because I didn't want to have that conversation anywhere. Tom or my mother could half hear it through a wall and fill in the rest wrong. Patricia Nolan had the kind of voice that made you sit up a little straighter, calm, unhurried. The voice of someone who has delivered difficult news for a living and stopped being afraid of silence a long time ago. She asked if I could come in person. "Some of this shouldn't be a phone call," she said. That sentence alone kept me awake most of the night before our meeting. Her office was on the 2nd floor of an old building. Downtown, above a shoe repair shop. 3 tall windows and a lot of case files, stacked in a way that looked organized only to her. She had a photograph on her desk of a golden retriever wearing a graduation cap, which I found strangely comforting. We sat down and I skipped the small talk. "Did my father change his will?" "Yes," she said. "Did he leave me something?" She looked at me over her glasses. "If by something you mean money." "No." "Good," I said, and meant it. "I've had enough surprises this month." She told me my father's primary concern, in the months before he died, had been protecting my mother financially and keeping Ashworth Hardware solvent through a transition. Whatever that transition ended up looking like. He hadn't cut Derek out of anything. He still loved my brother, him supported. Still wanted him supported. But somewhere in that spring, he'd started keeping a folder. Patricia opened it on the desk between us, but didn't hand it over yet. "Over about 4 years," she said. "Your father transferred roughly $91,000 to Derek in various forms. Direct loans, co-signed equipment financing, 2 payments made straight to the Erie supplier to keep us lawsuit from being filed. Most of that," she said, "was clearly authorized, clearly documented, clearly a father helping a son through a rough patch." I nodded. That sounded like Dad. Ice storms happen. Businesses wobble. He'd have wanted to help. "Then there's this," she said, and turned the folder around. It was a deed transfer document for 1 unit of the duplex next to the store, dated the previous November, with my father's signature at the bottom and a witness line beneath it. The witness line had Tom's name on it. I stared at it for what felt like a long time. My husband, witnessing a property transfer for my brother that I'd never heard one word about. On a document I was seeing for the first time for 4 months after my father died in his own stockroom, surrounded by the birdseed and pipe fittings he never got around to reorganizing. Patricia let the silence sit there, instead of filling it, which I appreciated more than she probably knew. Finally, I asked the only question that mattered. Did my father actually watch that signature happen? She closed the folder. That's the question your father was asking too, before he passed. And he didn't have an answer yet either. I drove home with the windows down, even though it was March and cold enough that my hands went numb on the wheel. I needed the cold. No. I needed something simple to focus on that wasn't the fact that the two men I trusted most, my father, dead, and my husband, very much alive, and reheating leftovers in our kitchen somehow both ended up standing up on the same piece of without me knowing either name was on it. Tom was at the stove when I got home, stirring something that smelled like garlic and regret. "Hey," he said. "Good day?" I put my keys down, slower than necessary. I met with Dad's attorney. His stirring hand paused for exactly 1 second and once you notice something like that, you cannot unnotice it. What did she want to tell you? What Dad changed before he died? He turned the burner down. Did he leave you something? Same question Derek had asked at the guest book. Same question everyone in this family seemed most interested in, before they'd even asked whether I was okay. No, I said. He didn't leave me money. I didn't say, you didn't have to, he said, quieter now. He looked at the pot instead of me. I put a folded piece of paper on the counter between us, a copy Patricia had let me take. I watched him unfold it. I watched him see his own name. There are marriages that survive a moment like that, and marriages that don't, and at that point in the evening, I genuinely did not know which one mine was going to be. What I did know, standings and my own drama. In my own kitchen with garlic burning slightly in the background because nobody had thought to turn the flame all the way off, was that I wasn't going to find out by pretending the paper didn't exist. I was going to find out the same way I'd built my entire career, by following the numbers, wherever they actually led, whether or not the people I loved were standing in the way. Tom, I said, I need you to tell me exactly what you signed, and exactly what you thought you were signing. He set the spoon down. Rachel, he started, and I said no. Not tonight, not the short version. All of it. Start from the beginning. He did. And what he told me over the next 20 minutes was the first thread in a story that would eventually pull loose almost everything my family had spent a decade not talking about out loud. Who my father actually trusted, what my brother had actually needed the money for, what my mother had chosen not to see, and what, exactly, my husband had agreed to look away from because it was easier than asking one more question. That night, after Tom went quiet and went to bed early, unable to hold my eyes for more than a few seconds at a time, I sat alone at the kitchen table with Patricia's folders and my father's actual handwriting in the margins of a legal pad she'd let me photograph. Near the bottom of one page, in his small cramped hardware store printing, he'd written I meased 4 words. And says that I read maybe a dozen times before I could put the phone down, ask Rachel. Not Derek. Below it, nothing else. Just those 4 words, sitting there like he'd meant to come back and finish the thought, and never got the chance. Patricia's folder had more in it than the deed. That was the part I hadn't let myself think about on the drive home, because one shock at a time is about all a person can metabolize in an evening. But the next morning, sitting in my car again, I was starting to notice how much of this story was happening in parking lots like my life had become a series of conversations too dangerous to have anywhere with walls. I called her back and asked what else was in there. "There's a loan document for the store itself," she said. "Not just the duplex. Your father took out a small business line of credit against Ashworth Hardware 18 months ago. $32,000, and the paperwork shows. The funds moved into an account and then out again within 9 days. I asked where they went. To Derek's supplier account in Erie, she said, which on its own isn't strange. Your father had done that before, out in the open, with your mother's knowledge. What's strange is that this particular loan was never mentioned to your mother at all. She found out about it from me 3 weeks ago, and she was as surprised as you're about to be. I asked why that one mattered more than the others, since he'd clearly bailed Derek out plenty of times before without hiding it. Patricia's answer stuck with me the rest of that day. Because your father's other loans to Derek were gifts he chose to give, openly, as himself. This one used the store as collateral, and if it isn't repaid, whoever holds that note can force a sale of a business that's been open for 35 years. And currently employs 4 people. And employs 4 people who have nothing to do with any of this. Your father figured that out about 4 months before he died. And it's the reason he called you in March. He wasn't asking a hypothetical question, Rachel. He's already signed something he didn't fully understand, and he knew it. That single sentence rearranged something in my head. All this time I'd been picturing my father as the steady one in this story. The man whose signature on a document meant the document was sound. Instead, he'd been exactly where I now was, reading fine print too late, trying to figure out how much damage had already been done, and running out of time to fix it. I asked Patricia the question I'd been avoiding since the funeral. Did Derek know Dad was starting to ask these questions? She was quiet for a second. Your father told me he'd confronted Derek once, in July, about the collateral loan, specifically. He asked Derek directly whether he understood what would happen to the store if the loan wasn't repaid. According to your father's notes, Derek told him not to worry about it, that it would be handled before it ever came to that. I asked how, exactly. Patricia said Derek didn't say, and your father didn't push, because your father didn't admitting he thought his son might let the store, go, under to save his landscaping business, and your father wasn't ready to believe that about him yet. Some days, Patricia said, he still wasn't sure he believed it. He just wanted somebody looking at the actual numbers instead of the family's version of the story. That's why he called you, not because he distrusted you less than everyone else. Because you were the only person in this family who reads a document before you sign it, and he needed exactly one of those. I sat with that for a long time, before I turned the key. That evening I didn't go straight home. I drove to the store instead, which had been closed since the funeral, except for a part-time manager, a woman named Corinne, who'd worked the paint counter for 19 years and had cried harder at Dad's funeral than half the family. She was there, doing inventory. When I let myself in with my old key, the brass bell over the door announcing me the same way it had announced every customer since 1988. Corinne looked up, and her face did something complicated. Happy to see me, worried about why I'd come. We sat on 2 overturned paint blankets near the register, while she told me things nobody had thought to ask her, because remembers that the woman running the paint counter for 2 decades sees more than most family members do. She told me Derek had been coming in more often the last year, sometimes alone, sometimes with a man she didn't recognize who wore a supplier's logo on his jacket. She told me, Dad had started keeping the store's checkbook in the office safe, instead of the drawer where it had always lived, which she'd never seen him do in 19 years. And she told me that about 6 weeks before he died, she'd overheard part of an argument through the stockroom door. Derek's voice raised, saying something like, "You don't get to decide that. It's not just yours anymore." She hadn't heard my father's response. She'd found a reason to be very busy at the front counter, until it was over. I asked her not to tell me anything else that night, not because I didn't want to know, but because I could feel myself starting to build a case instead of grieving my father. And some tiny, stubborn part of me still wanted one more evening where he was just a man I missed, not a man whose last months I was investigating. Like a stranger's tax return. I drove home in the dark past the duplex, the one with Tom's signature on its transfer paperwork, and saw a light on in the downstairs unit. The one my father had always rented to a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Ferris, who'd lived there 11 years and paid her rent like clockwork on the first of the month. I wondered if she even knew her landlord had changed. I wondered if Derek had told her, or if she was about to get a letter from a stranger. At home, Tom was waiting up, which told me he'd been thinking about our conversation all day too. He'd made tea, which was his particular apology language. The way some men bring flowers and Tom brings chamomile and a slightly too careful tone of voice. "I need to actually tell you the whole thing," he said, "before you hear it from someone else and it sounds worse than it was." I told him I was listening. "Derek came to me in October," he said. "Not your dad, Derek. No drama, Sutter. He said your dad had already signed the transfer, that it was something they'd talked about for months, helping Derek get equity to refinance the equipment loan, and that the only thing missing was a witness signature, because the notary they'd used hadn't required one, and their lawyer said it should have one anyway, just to be safe. He said, your dad was already stressed about money and didn't want to make another trip downtown for something that was already settled. He asked me to do it as a favor. I asked, "Did you see my father sign it?" Tom looked at his tea instead of me. "No," he said, "I didn't." I told him I trusted Derek to tell me the truth about his own father's decision, and I signed it because I didn't think it was my place to make my brother-in-law drive back to a notary over a technicality. I let that sit in the room for a moment before I asked the next question because I needed to know the answer before I decided how angry to be. "Did you know Dad had started questioning some of the money that went to Derek?" Tom's face changed slightly. "I knew there'd been some tension," he said. Derek mentioned, "Your dad had gotten stricter about paperwork lately. More suspicious than usual. I thought it was just grief coming early, older parents getting cautious. I didn't think it was." He stopped. I finished the sentence for him. "You didn't think it was about you." He didn't argue with that, which I respected more than I expected to. What hurt wasn't that Tom had made one bad decision in October. People make bad decisions under social pressure. I understand that better than most people, because I spend my professional life discovering exactly how often it happens in family businesses, specifically where nobody wants to be the one who says no to somebody they love at Thanksgiving. What hurt was realizing that Tom's instinct, when faced with a dame, stress no drama. When faced with a choice between mild discomfort with my brother and doing his due diligence for my father, had been to avoid the discomfort. And that this probably wasn't the first time. It was just the first time I'd had documentation. I asked him one more thing before I went upstairs alone that night. If Derek asked you to sign something like that again tomorrow, having lived through this, what would you do? He thought about it longer than I wanted him to. I'd ask more questions, he finally said. I told him that wasn't quite the answer I needed, but it was closer to honest than anything else. As he'd said all evening. So I let it stand for now. The following week, my mother called another family meeting, and this time I asked Patricia to come with me. Because I was done walking into rooms in my family without someone in my corner who'd actually read every page before we got there. My mother was not thrilled by that request. Why does a lawyer need to be at a family dinner, Rachel? She said on the phone, in the tone she used to use when I was 14 and wanted to know why curfew existed. Because it isn't dinner anymore, Mom, I told her. It's an estate with debts. With debts attached to it, and I'd rather understand what we're actually deciding before somebody hands me another folded piece of paper at a funeral. Funeral home. We met at the house on Larkspur Street. Again, my mother had made a pot roast nobody ended up eating much of. Derek arrived with Melissa 15 minutes late, and I watched his face when he saw Patricia sitting at the table with a folder in front of her instead of just family. Something flickered there. Not quite fear, more like recalculation. The look of a man realizing the meeting he'd prepared for wasn't the meeting that was actually about to happen. Patricia didn't waste time on preamble. She explained, in plain language, what she'd found. The gifts to Derek over 4 years, mostly documented and clearly authorized, no issue there.
The
Transfer for the duplex unit signed in November, witnessed by someone who, by his own account, hadn't watched the signature occur. And the $32,000 collateral loan against the store itself, moved to Erie within 9 days, never disclosed to my mother, and still outstanding. Yen. My mother's face went through several stages, while Patricia spoke, and I watched the second one land hardest. Not shock at the numbers, but the specific personal shock of learning her husband had kept something from her for the better part of a year. She turned to Derek. Did you know about the store loan? Derek's jaw did the thing. It does. Dad wanted to help me keep the business running, Mom. He knew what he was signing. I've never once asked him to sign anything he didn't understand. Then explain the witness line, Patricia said calmly. The way you'd point at a single wrong number on an otherwise clean spreadsheet. Explain why Tom witnessed a signature he told my client he did not personally observe. Derek looked at Tom. Tom looked at the table. Nobody explained anything for a long few seconds. Melissa spoke first, which surprised me, because up to that point she'd mostly stayed quiet at these gatherings. Present, but peripheral. I need to say something, she said, and her voice had an edge to it. I hadn't heard from her before. I've been watching all of you argue about paperwork for a month, and nobody's asked why any of this happened in the first place. Derek didn't take that loan because he's a con artist. He took it because our house was 2 payments from foreclosure last spring. And he was too proud to tell any of you that, including me, until the bank sent the second notice. I landed differently than anything Patricia's folder had said. Derek looked at his wife like she'd just handed something over he hadn't wanted anyone to see, which in a sense she had. He didn't correct her. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to tell this story as though my brother is simply a villain who saw an opportunity and took it. And that isn't quite true, even now, even knowing everything I eventually learned. Derek was drowning. The ice storm was real. The lawsuit threat from Erie was real. The possibility of losing his own house was real, and he'd been carrying that alone for months. rather than admit it to a family that had always seen him as the capable one, the one who didn't need help, the way his little sister occasionally did during her first divorce. Years back, when Dad had quietly covered 2 months of her rent and nobody made a single joke about it at Thanksgiving. My drama, Quar. Derek had spent his whole adult life being the sibling who didn't ask. And when he finally needed to ask for something enormous, he didn't know how to do it honestly. So he found a way to take it that felt, to him in the moment, less like theft and more like an inheritance arriving slightly ahead of schedule. That doesn't make it right. It makes it human, which is a different thing, and a harder one to simply be furious at. My mother, for her part, said something that night I didn't expect either. She looked at Derek for a long moment and said, "I would have found the money, Derek. If you'd told me the truth in March, instead of asking your father to hide it from me, I would have found a way." That was the sentence that actually cracked something open in the room. More than any of Patricia's numbers had. Because it revealed the thing underneath all of it. Not that my mother didn't love Derek enough to help him, but that Derek had decided, somewhere along the way, that being helped openly was a kind of failure he couldn't survive admitting to, especially to a father who'd built a entire identity out of not needing anyone. Patricia let the family sit with that for a minute before she brought us back to the practical matter at hand. Regardless of motive, she said, the collateral loan is a real liability against a real business, and it needs to be resolved in a way that protects the 4 employees who still work there, retirement and the retirement income your father intended. For Diane, that's not a moral question. That's a math problem, and I'd like to solve it before it becomes a legal one that costs this family a great deal more than $32,000. Dallin. That was the moment the evening stopped being about blame and started being about arithmetic, which honestly is where I do my best work. I asked Patricia what my father's most recent instructions actually said. In full, because up to that point I'd only heard fragments through voicemails and folder summaries. She opened a second file I hadn't seen yet. Thinner than the first, and read from it directly. Your father, 5 weeks before he died, had drafted an amendment establishing an independent oversight arrangement for the store's finances, naming a licensed fiduciary to manage major transactions until any outstanding business debt was resolved, specifically so that no single family member could unilaterally encumber the property again. He'd asked Patricia to identify a candidate. He never finalized the amendment. He died first. I asked whether that meant the oversight arrangement didn't exist at all. Patricia said, legally, no. An unsigned amendment isn't binding. But he left detailed notes about who he wanted in that role, and it wasn't a lawyer, and it wasn't Derek, and it wasn't Diane. She turned the page toward me so I could read his handwriting myself. Rachel would know how to read the numbers without being talked out of what they say. Ask her before anyone signs anything else. The room was very quiet. Derek was staring at the table again. My mother reached over, without a word, and put her hand over mine on the tablecloth, and I understood in that gesture that, whatever came next, at least one relationship in this family had just been repaired slightly, even while another one was still very much in pieces. I told them I wasn't interested in controlling anything that belonged to Derek, or to my mother, or to the store's future. I said the only thing I actually wanted was an accurate accounting. Every dollar, every document, laid out honestly, so that whatever we decided next we'd be deciding it with our eyes open, instead of with folded papers and half-explained favors. Patricia said she could formalize that as a temporary oversight role, while the estate settled. With my consent and the family's, nothing permanent, nothing that touched anyone's actual inheritance, just eyes on the numbers. Until the debt question was resolved, Darek didn't agree to it that night. He got up from the table before dessert, said something about needing air, and Melissa busted him out. My mother sat there with her hand, still resting near mine, looking older than she had at the start of the evening, and said quietly, "Your father would have hated watching us do this. In front of a lawyer, instead of just talking choi. Patricia, to her credit, answered gently, "That's exactly why he asked me to be here if you couldn't." Tom drove me home that night, mostly in silence. Somewhere around the halfway point he said, "I think I finally understand why he called you, and not Derek." I didn't answer right away. "Because Derek needed a rescuer," I finally said. Dad needed someone who'd tell him the truth even if it wasn't what he wanted to hear. Those aren't the same person, and it took him a long time to admit which one he actually needed most. That night, I lay awake, thinking about the brass bell on the store counter. The one Dad used to ring for no reason at all, just to hear it still worked. I kept thinking about how a bell can't tell you anything about what's true. It just tells you somebody walked through the door. What happens after that? Whether they're there to buy nails or to take something that was never really theirs. That part, nobody had ever been willing to look at closely enough. Until now, Derek didn't call me for 11 days after that dinner. I know because I counted, which tells you something about the kind of week it was. In the meantime, Patricia and I started going through the store's books properly. And Corrine at the paint counter turned out to be more useful than any single document in Patricia's folder, because she knew which invoices matched deliveries she'd actually signed for, and which ones she'd never seen a truck for at all. There were 2 of those. Small ones. Comparatively, an invoice for $1,100 in fencing supplies that never arrived at the store, paid out of the store's account 4 months before Dad died, and a second one for just under $2,000 marked as equipment repair that Corrine swore up and down never happened, because she'd have remembered a repair crew tearing up the back lot and nobody had. Both payments had gone out under Dad's authorization, his actual signature, not a forgery. But when I pulled the corresponding bank records, both amounts had moved, within days, into an account belonging to Ashworth Lawn and Landscape. I sat with that for a long time before I called Patricia. "This is different from the collateral loan," I told her. "Dad didn't hide this one from Mom by accident. Somebody wrote fake invoice descriptions to make it look like ordinary store expenses." Patricia was quiet on the other end for a second. "Do you think your father knew that?" I honestly didn't know. Part of me, my slaging, part of me wanted to believe he hadn't, that somebody had slipped these past him while he was distracted by grief over the bigger loan, by his own declining health, by 35 years of trusting people at his own counter. News. Another part of me, the part that reads financial statements for a living, knew that a man who caught the discrepancy on a $32,000 loan within 9 days of it moving wasn't the kind of man who missed 2 invoices for equipment repairs. That never happened. I found the answer 4 days later, not from Patricia, but from Dad's own handwriting. Corrine mentioned, almost as an afterthought while we were going through a filing cabinet in the back office, that Dad had started keeping a second small notebook in his coat pocket. That last year. Not the store ledger, something personal. She didn't know where it had gone after he died, Neither did my mother. It turned up, eventually, in the pocket of the coat still hanging on the hook by the store's back door, exactly where he'd left it. The last morning he ever walked into that building. I found it on a Sunday, alone, because I hadn't wanted an audience for whatever was in it. The handwriting got smaller toward the end, tighter, like he was trying to fit more thoughts onto fewer pages before he ran out of either time or certainty. There were dates. There were dollar amounts. And there was an entry, dated about 6 weeks before he died, that read, "Fencing invoice doesn't match Corinne's delivery log. Repair invoice. No crew. No truck. Nobody remembers it. D. Says vendor made an error, will fix it. Nothing's been fixed." Don't want to believe what this looks like. 2 pages later, closer to the end of the notebook, in handwriting that looked like it had been written late at night or in a hurry. "If something happens to me, before this gets sorted, tell Rachel first. Not because I don't trust the others. Because she's the only one who'll actually read it. Before she decides how to feel about it." I sat on the floor of that back office for a while after reading that. Not crying. Exactly. Past the point where this particular kind grief acts out as tears. More like sitting very still. The way you do when you've just understood something that rearranges every conversation you've had for the last month. My father had known. Not everything, maybe, but enough. He'd been carrying that knowledge alone in his coat pocket for 6 weeks, still hoping he was wrong, still hoping his son would fix it before he had to say the word theft out loud to anyone, including himself. I called Derek that afternoon, the first time either of us had spoken since he walked out of Mom's dining room. I didn't lead with the notebook. I asked him, plainly, about the 2 invoices. There was a long pause on the line, long enough that I could hear him breathing, deciding something. "Those were mistakes," he finally said. "The fencing thing was a vendor error," I told Dad that. "The repair invoice was." I told him it was for a job that fell through, and the deposit didn't get refunded in time, so I asked if I could use it toward what he already owed. I mean, what he already agreed to give me. I stopped him there. "Derek, those invoices were written up as store expenses. Store equipment repairs. Not loans to you, not gifts, not anything with your name on it, anywhere. Somebody wrote descriptions on those payments. Specifically so Mom wouldn't ask questions, and specifically so an auditor wouldn't flag them as related party transactions. That's not a vendor error. That's called disguising the paper trail. And I've built a career catching exactly that pattern in other people's businesses." He didn't say anything for a while. Then, quieter than I'd heard him in years, he said, "I didn't write the invoices, Rach." I asked. "Then who did?" Another long pause. "Melissa handles our books," he said. "She's the one who talks to our accountant." I told her the store had agreed to help cover some equipment costs. And he stopped himself again. I finished it for him, because I could see exactly where this was going, the same way I can usually see the end of financial statements, the end of a set of financials about 4 pages before the client wants me to. She's the one who wrote the descriptions to make it look clean. There was a long silence, and then Derek said something I hadn't expected. "I don't know how much she actually understood versus how much I let her believe," he said. "I told her Dad wanted to help and didn't want Mom worrying about it. I don't know if I ever told her clearly enough that Dad hadn't actually agreed to those 2, specifically. I think." He stopped again. I think I let it be vague on purpose. Because vague was easier than either lying to her directly or telling her the truth, which, was that I didn't have Dad's permission, and I was scared to ask for it after the loan thing had already gotten so tense between us. Swaz. That was the moment my brother stopped being, in my mind, a simple villain. In a story I could tell cleanly at some future family gathering. He was still responsible. Responsibility doesn't evaporate. Because your motives are complicated, and I want to be honest about that, because too many of these family stories end with everybody deciding nobody's really at fault. The deciding Marbiev dishonested, that's its own kind of dishonesty. But underneath the theft was a man who had built an entire strategy out of never directly asking his own father for help and never directly lying to his own wife, choosing, instead, to leave just enough fog around both relationships that he could tell himself, on his worst nights, that he hadn't really deceived anyone. He'd just let them believe what was easiest. I asked him the question that actually mattered to me at that point, more than the money. Did you know Dad was worried about this before he died? Derek's voice cracked slightly. He asked me about the invoices in June, he said. I told him it was handled. I meant to actually handle it. I kept meaning to. And then he died before I did, and now I don't know how to fix something. With a person who isn't here to tell me it's fixed. I let that sit between us for a moment before I said the thing I'd been turning over since I found the notebook. He wanted you to tell the truth, Derek, not fix it quietly. Not make the paperwork look clean. He wanted one honest conversation before it was too late. And you gave him a vague reassurance instead, and now that's the last thing he had to go on. That's the part I don't think you can undo with a repayment plan. That's the part you're going to have to sit with regardless of how the money gets settled. He didn't argue with me. That, more than anything, told me something had actually shifted. Melissa called me 2 days later, on her own. Without Derek's knowledge, as far as I could tell. She asked to meet somewhere neutral. And we ended up at a diner off the highway, the kind of place with laminated menus and a waitress who called both of us honey without irony. She didn't waste time getting to the point, which I'd started to appreciate about her, even when I didn't like what she had to say. I need you to know. I didn't set out to trick anyone, she said. When Derek told me your dad had agreed to help cover some equipment costs, I believed him. I write descriptions on invoices the way any small business does. Vague enough not to bore an accountant, specific enough to be defensible. I didn't think I was hiding anything, because Derek told me it was already agreed to. I asked her, when did you start suspecting it wasn't? She looked down at her coffee. When the second one went through, and your dad never mentioned it to Diane. And Derek got weird every time I brought it up. I told myself it wasn't my business, that it was between Derek and his father. I think some part of me didn't want to know the real answer. Because if I asked and didn't like what I heard, I'd have had to actually do something about it. And we were already 2 payments from losing our house. It was easier to not ask. That sentence, it was easier to not ask, was, I realized later, the exact center of this entire story. Not just Melissa's version of it. My father hadn't asked Derek directly for months because he didn't want to accuse his son of something he might be wrong about. Tom hadn't asked whether Dad had actually signed that deed in front of him, because asking would have meant an uncomfortable phone call with my brother. And no stress, no drama. My mother hadn't asked where the collateral loan money had gone. And because some part of her already suspected and didn't want the suspicion confirmed. Melissa hadn't asked her own husband for the plain truth about invoices she was personally putting her name on. because the truth might have required her to say no to him. During the worst year of their marriage, an entire family, myself included in earlier years, had built a kind of fragile peace out of nobody asking anybody the one question that actually mattered, and my father, the person who'd spent 35 years running an honest hardware store on a handshake and a bell that still rang, had ended up the only one willing to break that pattern, alone, in a coat pocket notebook. Nobody read until it was too late to answer him. Melissa asked, near the end of our coffee, what I planned to do with everything I now knew. I told her the truth, which was that I didn't want Derek in jail, and I didn't want to burn down what was left of my mother's remaining years, chasing every dollar through a courtroom. I wanted the store's books clean, the collateral loan resolved in a way that didn't threaten Corinne's job, or the other 3 employees who had nothing to do with any of this, and I wanted an honest accounting of what Derek actually owed the estate, separate from what he'd been legitimately given as gifts over the years. What happens after that? I told her, between you and Derek, isn't something I get a vote in. But I'd stop believing whatever version of events is easiest to hear. That's what got all of us here in the first place. 2 weeks later, we sat down for what Patricia called a settlement conference, a snowman conference, though it felt less like a legal proceeding and more like the family dinner. None of us had actually managed to have since the funeral. It was in Patricia's office this time, not the house on Larkspur Street. My mother's idea, actually, who said she didn't think she could sit at that dining table again and watch another hard conversation happen under the same light fixture. Dad used to complain was too dim to eat by. Everyone was there: my mother, Derek and Melissa, Tom, Patricia, and a fiduciary accountant named Samuel Reyes, whom Patricia had brought in to formalize the oversight role Dad had never gotten to finalize himself. Not permanent, not controlling anyone's inheritance, just an independent set of eyes on the store finances, conduct financing. Until the collateral loan and the 2 disguised invoices were fully resolved. Samuel walked through the numbers. First, plainly, without drama, the way I'd have done it myself if it hadn't been my own family sitting across the table. The gifts over 4 years, documented, authorized, no dispute, staying exactly as gifts. The collateral loan against the store, $32,000, still outstanding, to be repaid through a structured plan drawn from Derek's share of the eventual estate distribution, rather than forcing an immediate sale of anything. And the 2 disguised invoices, totaling just under $3,000. Reclassified from store expenses to a personal advance against Derek's inheritance, with interest calculated from the original payment dates, because that's simply what the numbers required if we were being honest about what they actually were. Nargreed drama. Derek didn't argue with any of it. That surprised me more than anything else that afternoon. He sat with his hands folded on the table and let Samuel finish, and when it was his turn to speak, he said, I want to pay all of it back, not just what you're structuring through the estate. I want it gone. I don't want any of it attached to Dad's name anymore. My mother spoke next, and what she said surprised me too. I'm not signing off on anything that protects the store's employees less than it protects my own comfort, she said. Corinne's worked there 19 years. She deserves to know her job isn't hostage to any of this. Patricia assured her. The structure protected exactly that, which seemed to be the only piece of the whole conversation. That actually settled something in my mother's shoulders. There wasn't a moment where Derek broke down and confessed everything in a single dramatic speech, the kind you'd expect from a movie version of this story. No stand-famiation, There wasn't a moment where my mother forgave him fully, either, or where Melissa apologized and everyone hugged it out over the conference table. What there was, instead, was an hour and a half of specific, unglamorous arithmetic, everyone in the room agreeing to numbers instead of narratives, which is, in my experience, the only kind of family reconciliation that ever actually holds. Tom didn't say much during the meeting itself. Afterward, in the parking lot, he told me he'd offered to formally correct the witness statement on the deed transfer on record, stating plainly that he hadn't observed the signature occur. Patricia's already got the paperwork, he said. I should have done it the day you found out, instead of making you ask me twice. I told him I appreciated it, and I meant it, though I also told him honestly that appreciating it and fully trusting his judgment against were two different things, and one of them was going to take longer than the other to rebuild. He nodded, like he'd expected that answer, and didn't argue with it, which counted for something. I drove past the store on my way home. That evening, out of habit more than necessity. The lights were off, the closed signs still hanging in the window, but through the glass I could see the counter and the bell sitting exactly where it had sat for 35 years, waiting for somebody to walk through the door and give it a reason to ring. The second set of keys turned up almost by accident, the way most of the worst discoveries in this story did. Mrs. Ferris, the retired schoolteacher who'd rented the downstairs unit of the duplex for 11 years, called the store 2 weeks after the settlement conference, asking whether somebody could come at a leak under her kitchen sink. Corinne passed the message to me, since I was still the one people called when anything Ashworth adjacent came up, and I drove over that Saturday more out of habit than obligation. Mrs. Ferris was in her 70s, sharp as anything. Mima is in the kind of former teacher who still corrected your grammar, without meaning to be rude about it. While I waited for the plumber she'd also called, she made tea and mentioned, almost in passing, that she was glad somebody in the family was finally handling things properly. Your brother used to let himself in sometimes, she said, when your father was still alive. I asked what she meant. He had his own key, she said. Came by every so often to check the water heater, or so he told me. I never minded. Landlord's son seemed reasonable enough. I asked her whence that had started. Maybe 18 months ago, she said, around when your dad started slowing down a little. I remember because he stopped coming by himself as often, and Derek started instead. I didn't say anything to her about what that meant. I thanked her for the tea, waited for the plumber, and drove straight to Patricia's office instead of home. Here is what that detail actually did to the story once I sat with it. It didn't prove anything new about the deed transfer or the disguised invoices. Those cases were already settled, numbers already agreed to, repayment plan already signed. What it did was answer a smaller, quieter question that had been sitting underneath everything else since the funeral. Derek hadn't needed to break into anything, hadn't needed to forge anything more than he already had. He'd simply had access, quietly, for a year and a half, to a property that was still legally our father's, walking in and out with a key. Nobody else knew he carried, at a time when our father was starting to slow down and not always remember exactly which visits he'd authorized and which ones he hadn't. I don't think that key, by itself, was ever used for anything sinister. I never found evidence that Derek altered a single document inside that duplex, or removed anything from it that wasn't his to take. What the key told me instead was something about the shape of the whole year. How slowly and quietly a kind of access can be normalized inside a family. One small favor at a time. Until nobody quite remembers agreeing to the arrangement and, by the time somebody asks God the obvious question, the answer is already 18 months old and impossible to fully untangle. I asked Derek about it directly, the way I'd learned to ask things by then. Plainly, with the fact already in hand instead of fishing for it. He didn't deny it. Dad gave me that key himself, years ago, he said. Before any of this. I never had it copied for anything shady, Rachel. I used it to check the water heater like Mrs. Ferris said. I told him I believed that part. What I didn't say. Because I'd already said enough hard things to my brother that spring, was that the key had stopped being only about the water heater a long time before either of us wanted to admit it. That it had become, without either of them fully noticing, a kind of standing permission that outlived whatever it had originally been for, the same way the disguised invoices had started as one uncomfortable ask and quietly became a habit. I didn't report the key to anyone. There wasn't a crime attached to it, not one Patricia could point to in any statute, and King Josie no drama. And pursuing it further would have meant subpoenaing Mrs. Ferris's memory of a year and a half of small visits, dragging a 70-something retired teacher into a family dispute she'd had the bad luck to overhear the edges of. I made a different decision instead. One that I think Dad would have understood, even if he wouldn't have loved watching it happen. I had the locks changed on both units of the duplex, quietly, the following week. And I told Derek about it afterward, rather than asking his permission beforehand. Which was, I'll admit, a small and deliberate reversal of every conversation he'd ever had. With our father, about paperwork I hadn't fully explained. He didn't argue about the locks. That told me something too. By early summer, the repayment structure Samuel Reyes had drawn up was actually holding C. Derek had taken a second job doing landscape consulting for a commercial property management company, 2 towns over. Steady work. Less glamorous than running his own crew, but reliable in a way his own business hadn't been in 2 years. A portion of every paycheck went automatically toward the estate repayment plan, on top of what would eventually come out of his inheritance share. It wasn't a fast repayment. Samuel had structured it over 4 years, which felt, to me, uncomfortably slow some days and reasonably humane on others depending on how recently I'd reread that notebook. The store stayed open. Open. That mattered more to me than I expected it to, once the collateral loan was restructured. And the immediate threat to Corinne's job and the other 3 employees' jobs had passed. I started going in on Saturday mornings some weeks, not to manage anything. Corinne ran that place better than any of us ever could. But because standing behind that counter, hearing the bell ring when somebody walked in for a box of screws or a can of the specific blue paint, Dad had mixed for half the porches in Millvale, felt like the only place left where my father was still fully, uncomplicatedly himself, uninterrupted by any of it. My mother struggled the most that summer, in a way I hadn't fully anticipated. It's one thing to grieve a husband. It's another thing to grieve him, while also learning, in pieces, that he'd carried a private worry about their son for the last 6 months of his life, and hadn't told her any of it. She asked me once, sitting on her porch in July, why he hadn't just come to her directly. I told her the truth as best I understood it, that he hadn't wanted to accuse Derek of something and be wrong about it, and that accusing him, to her, felt, to Dad, like it would become real the moment he said it out loud. In a way, it hadn't quite become real yet while it stayed folded up in a coat pocket. She sat with that a long time before she said, "That sounds exactly like him," and I never really knew if that observation comforted her or made the whole thing worse. I think it did, both. On different days. Melissa and Derek separated for about 6 weeks each that summer. Not over the money directly, she told me later, but over the discovery of just how much stress had grown between them, while they were both quietly managing separate versions, handles of the same crisis, without fully telling each other the truth of it. Hinana Senins was gone, drama. My Mondri non and my green. They got back together in the fall, though back together undersells what it actually looked like. Less like resuming an old marriage, and more like two people deciding carefully whether to build a new one out of what was left. I don't know if it will last. I've stopped assuming I can predict which relationships survive a year like that one, having watched my own wobble in ways I never expected. Tom and I went to counseling starting that June, which he resisted for the first several sessions in the specific, low-grade way he resists most things he doesn't want to examine too closely, showing up, answering questions, but keeping the answers just vague enough to avoid actually saying anything. Our counselor, a woman named Ellen, who had an unfortunate habit of letting silence sit far longer than either of us was comfortable with, eventually got him to say something that stuck with me. He said that whenever anyone in my family asked him for a small favor, his instinct was always to say yes first and think about it later, because saying no felt, to him, like picking a side, and he'd spent our entire marriage assuming that not picking sides was the same thing as being neutral. It took him most of the summer to understand that it wasn't. Neutral in a family like mine usually just meant whoever asked last got the favor, regardless of whether it was actually the right thing to sign. I didn't move out during any of this, unlike some versions of this story I've heard from other women in situations not too different from mine. I stayed. I want to be honest about why, because I think it matters. It wasn't because Tom's mistake was small. It wasn't, and I don't think either of us has fully finished paying for it, emotionally even, now. It was because I watched him actually change the way he handled things. Over that summer, in small, boring, unglamorous ways that were easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. He started asking me questions before agreeing to things involving my family. He called Patricia directly, on his own, to formally correct the witness statement, instead of waiting for me to arrange it. He started, slowly, becoming a person who asked the uncomfortable question instead of assuming the easier answer was probably close enough to true. I don't think that makes up for October. I think it's the only thing that could have made staying possible at all. Near the end of that summer, I took on a new client at work, almost by accident. A family-owned auto repair shop, 2 counties over, run by a father in his 60s and his adult daughter, who'd come to me specifically because a mutual acquaintance mentioned I had experience untangling family businesses where the paperwork and the relationships had gotten a little too tangled together to see clearly. I sat across the table from that father and daughter during our first meeting, watching the particular way she deferred to him even while clearly knowing more about the actual books than he did. And I thought about my own father's 4-word note, "Ask Rachel." Not Derek. I've started taking more of those clients since. Not because it's more profitable. It usually isn't. But because I understand now in a way I didn't a year ago. Exactly what it costs a family when nobody in the room is willing to be the person who reads the whole document before anybody signs it. Fall came, and with it, the 1-year mark of Dad's collapse in that stockroom, between the pipe fittings and the birdseed. He never got around to moving. I drove up to Millvale alone that morning, before the store opened, and let myself in with my own key, rather than Kareen's spare. I stood behind the counter for a while in the early light, the way he used to before customers arrived, and I rang the bell once, for no reason at all, the way he always used to, just to hear that it still worked. It did. I drove to the cemetery afterward, with his notebook in my bag, the one I'd found in his coat pocket that Sunday, the pages softer now, from how many times I'd turned them. I stood by the stone for a while, without saying much out loud, because I've never been someone who talks to graves the way people do in movies, and grief, in my experience, mostly just sits quietly beside you rather than announcing itself in speeches. I opened the notebook to the last real entry, the one I'd read a dozen times that first week, and read it once more, standing there in the cool October air. If something happens to me before this gets sorted, tell Rachel first. Not because I don't trust the others. Because she's the only one who'll actually read it before she decides how to feel about it. I thought about Derek's whisper at the funeral home, the one that had started all of this, folded piece of paper sliding across the guest book table. "You're not in the will." "Not, Rachel?" Dad told me himself. I understand now what he actually meant when he said it, and I don't think he was entirely lying. Not the way I'd assumed he was that first week. Dad's will, the actual document, the one filed at the courthouse, distributed the house and the retirement accounts and the personal property in exactly the way it always had, split evenly between his two children, nothing hidden, nothing dramatic, no secret fortune waiting for me in some clause nobody else knew about. Derek was right about that. I never was, and was never meant to be, some hidden primary beneficiary in that document. What he didn't understand, what none of them understood, until Patricia opened that second folder, was that the will was never the part that mattered most. My father hadn't left me an inheritance. He'd left me a responsibility. 4 words scrawled in a coat pocket notebook. Nobody read until it was almost too late. And in a strange way, that turned out to be worth more to this family than any dollar amount ever could have been. Not because I got to control anything. I didn't want to. And I made sure, from the very first meeting with Patricia, that I, never would beyond what the immediate crisis actually required. But because someone in this family, finally, had been willing to ask the plain, uncomfortable question before signing, and it turned out that was the one thing my father had needed most. In the last 6 months of his life, and never quite got from anyone until it was too late to matter to him directly. It mattered to the rest of us instead. That's not nothing. Some days, standing in that store with the bell, still ringing it always has, the same way it always has-y. It feels like almost everything. Winter came back to Millvale, the way it always does. Fast, and a little unkind, the first hard frost, hitting the week before Thanksgiving. I hosted that year, which surprised everyone including me, since Larkspur Street had always been my mother's job. And I'd never once volunteered to take it over. She let me though, without much argument, which told me something about how tired that house had made her over the past 12 months. It wasn't a perfect table. Derek and Melissa came, quieter than they used to be, still working their way back toward whatever their marriage was going to become. My mother sat at the end. not in Dad's old chair, which nobody had discussed, but everybody had somehow silently agreed to leave empty. At every gathering since. Tom carved badly. The way he always has. And nobody corrected him this time. Which felt like its own small kind of peace. Derek and I didn't hug it out over turkey. And I want to be honest about that, because I think stories like this one too often promise a bow at the end. That real families rarely get to tie. We were civil. We were, in a cautious, unfinished way, starting to be brothers and sisters again, instead of two people negotiating a repayment schedule through a fiduciary. At one point, he caught me alone in the kitchen, refilling water glasses, and said, quietly, "I still owe you an actual apology, not just a settlement." I told him the settlement had been fine, but the apology would be nice too, whenever he was ready to give the long version instead of the short one. He nodded, like he understood the difference, and for the first time in a year, I believed he actually did. Corrine still runs the paint counter. The bell still rings. Mrs. Ferris still pays her rent on the first of the month, to an account Samuel Reyes oversees now, at least until the last of the repayment plan clears in a few more years. Some mornings I still drive past the store on my way somewhere else entirely. And some mornings I stop just to stand behind the counter for a minute, in the quiet, before anybody's come through the door. I never did get anything written into that will. Derek was right about that the whole time. In the narrowest, most literal sense of what he said at the funeral home, but he was wrong about what it meant. And I think, in the end, that's the only part of this story that actually mattered.